Everything's under control. We've got units inbound. Hot Pursuit, Roger, 101,
Police.
Yankee Sierra.
Apart from that, no comment.
You might remember me talking about writing and running a mega game in a previous video or two, and the update here is we did! It happened! We also filmed it extensively. I roped in a friend from my old job and she recorded about 9 hours of footage. It's actually a bit insane. You'll see some of that in this video, but I'll be cutting it into a trailer, as well as a short and longer cut of the game as a whole. Here though, I just wanted to discuss what it was, why we did it, how we did it, and whether or not we'll be doing it again. First of all, for anyone who doesn't know, a mega game is somewhere between an RPG, a war game, and a LARP. A large group of players, in our case 25, get together and collectively play in the same game. Players split into teams and are given specific roles within those teams. It's not competitive, but it's also not entirely cooperative. Every player works to find their own objective, their own win condition, if you like. In an RPG sense, everyone had a character, the mayor, the medic, the priest, and so forth. Each team had its own agenda, and some players had a few snippets of information to help inform how they might want to play the game. But ultimately they were encouraged to explore the game and choose their own path. Because a megagame is primarily a role-playing game, and the variability between the different games seems to be the amount of wargaming and or board gaming the designer has incorporated. It feels like a significant amount of the megagame scene is being led by wargamers, and a lot of the games are basically big group wargames with additional roleplay, but it's a broad spectrum for sure. Anyway, I'm not here to dissect megagames as a concept, particularly since I have very little experience of them.
Independent Square suggests that City Hall has taken advantage of the crisis to manufacture a drug problem with drugs supplied by the university and distributed by the police.
Oh my flippity flip.
They claim to have lots of evidence.
Oh my gosh!
They claim to have...
That is indeed a scoop too.
Back in April, I was trying to figure out some kind of live event I could run in association with this channel, something in the field of role-playing or board games, and while scouring the internet for inspiration, I stumbled across the Shut Up and Sit Down videos about Watch the Skies, a mega game about aliens arriving on Earth and the players acting as the various countries of the world, trying to make sense of it, with some players acting as the aliens as well. I had previously been aware that megagames existed, but this was my first real exposure to what they actually are. I proceeded to seek out as many megagame videos as I could, and I'll include links below to Dice Decisions in Diplomacy, a channel that makes long-form videos showing actual gameplay across a variety of megagames, as well as the Megacon channel, which is a series of behind-the-scenes talks with the big names of the megagame hobby. A hobby that is still relatively new and very niche. It has an audience for sure, and even my little game ended up selling out, but it's still very specialist, if only because of the time and effort it takes to run such a game. So you might have noticed at this point in my megagame study that I have not actually played a megagame, and as of recording this, I still haven't. So I have never played, never run, just watched a bunch of videos and felt hugely inspired to run a big group RPG with its own rules and settings I would have to write, design, create components for, and manage like a convention floor. I make smart choices. I started with looking at the concept and thinking, what would I want to be able to do? Because I had no frame of reference for what could be done, and I latched onto the idea of crafting in a post-apocalyptic world. The players in teams building shelters, scavenging for food, and battling for territory in the wastelands of London. But those of you who played in the game will know that that is not where we ended up. But that was the starting point, and I began planning with that in mind, inspired somewhat heavily by This War of Mine, both the video and board game, wherein players are attempting to survive in a war zone. I was also smart enough to recruit some outside help, firstly in the form of Gavin, the director of our actual play shows, whose voice you might occasionally hear in the background giving us instructions, mostly to stop goofing around and get on with it. I also reached out to a few members of the megagame crowd and started bouncing ideas around there. It turned out my concept was not too dissimilar to a megagame already in production called Aftermath, a post-apocalyptic free-for-all where players' factions range from the last remnants of the government to circus performers looking to put on a show. So I grabbed up various rulebooks for megagames and began studying. Luckily, I'm also a regular attendee of the UK Games Expo, for the last few years as a volunteer at the Blood and the Clock Tower stand. So I'm fairly familiar with that space, and I do a lot of convention floor stuff and generally running games about London. Point there is that I knew there would be megagames running at the UK Games Expo and that a lot of the people I was chatting with online would be there. So I arranged to meet some of them and found a window I could observe a game in progress, specifically the Den of Wolves game, a game inspired by the Battlestar Galactica board game where players are controlling the various ships of a fleet trekking across space whilst a hostile force pursues them, with some players secretly being allied with that enemy. From observing that game, I got my first taste of what the chaos in the room actually felt like, and it was eye-opening. The way players would run wild with the tiniest idea, how information could become obscured and muddied so easily, individual stories growing in the sea of chaos, and how much you could just trust the players to control their own mechanics. Honestly, that was my biggest takeaway, or my biggest relief. Players could be trusted to run the game without cheating or getting too confused, because the point wasn't to win, it was to have fun, and overcoming a challenge is more interesting than gaming the system. The exact timeline of this is going to get a little fuzzy because I have a terrible memory, but at some point seasoned Megagamer Ed Silverstone, who I met in person for the first time at the Games Expo, officially came on board as part of the team. The one member of our newly formed trio that actually knew something about Megagames. He became our sounding board and voice of reason for the arguably half-baked ideas I was coming up with. And here's where my laziness starts to inform the design process, but in like a positive way. During the early days of working on the post-apocalyptic Warzone survival game, it became apparent that the subject of risk management was going to come up. Town councils and other bodies will in fact effectively play megagames to prepare for disasters and events in a team building kind of way. There's a logic and formula that can be applied to the concept that interests some people, but I wasn't one of them. People in the megagame scene expressed that they had experience of that they were willing to assist me, but I know myself and I can tell when I'm losing interest, and it's a slippery slope from there to giving up entirely, so I knew that was not an avenue I wanted to pursue. I appreciate that a level of realism can be interesting, but I was not going to research real-world disaster management for mechanics that I needed to incorporate, so I started designing a fictional city and indeed a fictional world to run the game in, but the others started to question if that was just going to cause confusion. Which, to be fair, it probably was. A recognisable setting can work to fill in a lot of the gaps in your world building and take the pressure of having to explain the logic of your world. But I was still unsure about the real world setting and wanted something I could modify as needed, and it just so happens I'm a bit of a Cthulhu nut. I'm a big fan of Lovecraft's work, problematic though a lot of it is, but it's interesting that his prejudices and fears in a curious way must have fueled the existential horror of the unknown that he is so famous for. I don't recall how the suggestion of setting the game in the Cthulhu mythos came about exactly, but as soon as it was suggested, I latched onto it and it made so much sense. Rather than have to manufacture a reason for the apocalyptic state, we now had a whole universe to draw inspiration from, and importantly, a semi-familiar fictional setting we could use, Arkham City. However, all the early design work had been done in the present, if not slightly futuristic setting, so rather than scrap all of that, I decided to simply update the mythos setting to the present day, renaming the city New Arkham and allowing a modern understanding of technology. Whether or not we will redesign the game to a more traditional Lovecraftian early 20th century setting is a conversation we will definitely have, but for the first attempt we felt it was best not to have to think about it, though in retrospect I don't think it would have made mechanically much of an effect on the game. Regardless, we had our final idea, a Cthulhu mythos game in the modern age about survival in an increasingly apocalyptic city of New Arkham. We didn't want the game to expand beyond the borders of the city, so we manufactured a vague reason for why outside help was unavailable and started working on the core mechanics.
Being driven mad by the cosmic horror of the existential nonsense that you encounter.
I strongly wanted each team to be playing a unique worker placement game with a largely unique board that applied to their faction and their faction only. There was some crossover, but each faction had a very distinct set of actions it could perform. Every faction was playing its own game, and the players in that faction had a unique set of characters for them to play. There were a lot of characters repeated about the room, every faction had a leader for example, but I tried to make each combination unique and the variables within the factions special in some way. This was 7 very different games with 25 relatively unique characters. This was the one thing I wanted to get right because whilst it is something I could see come up in the roleplay of other mega games, rarely did I see it being represented mechanically. In Watch the Skies, for example, human factions all look basically the same. The variability comes from the team's goals and a few abilities, but everyone is ultimately playing the same game. This isn't bad by any stretch, in fact it's much easier to design one universal game system that you can add as many players as you like to, but I decided to give myself way more work than that, because smart choices. Now, ultimately there's only so much you can change things up. Mechanically, is the hospital deploying ambulances to disasters really that different to the police deploying squad cars to crime scenes? But on the whole, I think we achieved something somewhat unique. But again, my lack of experience in the megagame scene may be hindering my understanding. Separate to all this, of course, were the universal rules that affected all players, which were largely represented in a few ways. Firstly, the city map. The city map was where disaster effects happened, namely green for medical and red for criminal, where factions could deploy units to try and influence the city, and where the story of our game came into play, the investigation cards. In the original design, these were called exploration cards, and they were designed to be slightly risky things the players could attempt in order to find extra supplies or useful tech. With the addition of the Cthulhu theme, they became investigation cards for thematic reasons and took on a more supernatural element. There were still some useful things to find, but several of them referred to unnatural events or otherworldly findings that fed into the story happening beneath the surface of the game. The story that we weren't sure we would actually come out, but that existed if we needed it. Through the course of the design process, this deck became increasingly complicated, and I realised I could take inspiration from the board game Time Stories, a game that weaves a complex narrative between several decks of cards. I needed players to make choices without knowing the consequences of those choices in advance, so the investigation cards were seeded with prompts to draw from another deck, the Numbers deck. This deck had additional information and follow-on cards from the investigation cards, meaning the players could perform an investigation with multiple outcomes, each outcome found on a different card in the Numbers deck, like a choose-your-own-adventure book. And thus, we had our game. The player teams compete for resources to stay afloat, each with their own agenda and capabilities. A few individual player stories seeded throughout, and a larger story seeded amongst the player abilities to investigate the city itself. So let's take specifics.
So, here's how this is going to work.
Firstly, we had our control team, the players running the game. We divided the teams up so we could focus on individual needs, and I worked as overall plot and map control, keeping an eye on the bigger picture. I won't dwell too much on the mechanics of that, because that's basically what this whole video is about, but if you don't know how a Megagame works, there's always a team of game masters who can answer the players' questions and invent new rules when needed. Our players were City Hall, made up of the Mayor, Deputy Mayor and Press Secretary. They were tracking the general panic level of the city, and some of their abilities were directly affected by it, so they were motivated to keep it low. They had the power to enact laws that could add rules to the game, or indeed do almost anything. St Mary's Hospital, made up of the Chief of Medicine, Dispatcher, Medic and Pathologist, one of the more mechanics-led teams. They were responsible for deploying ambulances and medics to the city map to deal with medical disasters, sickness, major accidents, or in our case, the collateral damage caused by overzealous police raids. Speaking of the police, their team was made up of the Chief of Police, Dispatcher, Detective and Coroner. Like the hospital, their job was disaster management, except they were concerned with crime in the city rather than disease, represented by red tokens. They also contended with the narrative elements of crime given to other teams by Control. Union Station, our press team, more or less, made up of the station master, broadcaster and 2 runners. I refer to this team more or less as the press team because their role was less about reporting the news and more about creating it. I could be wrong, but I interpret the press in other games as somewhat disconnected from the story. They're there to quite literally report on what the other players are doing without having much agency themselves, though again, I could be mistaken. Nonetheless, here I wanted our press team to be more proactive. I gave them abilities and goals more designed to cause problems than uncover them, encouraging them to always assume the worst and consider themselves the arbiters of truth in a world of liars. This paired well with Independent Square, made up of the leader, dispatcher, scavenger and runner. This was actually an even spread of the basic powers of the game, making them arguably the most balanced team on paper. This team's goal was separatism. The chaos of New Arkham wasn't going away, so the old rules didn't matter anymore. The new rule of law was called for. Their goal was essentially to form an independent state within the city, boost their production and convince the other factions that they could do a better job than City Hall. We had South Church, made up of the pastor, preacher, acolyte and runner. They were a bit of a wild card conceptually, just as capable of becoming the saviours of the city as they were the harbingers of its doom. They had a unique currency, faith, that they could distribute to reasons we had not yet decided on at the start of the game, but we hoped they would be encouraged to come up with unique uses for it, and that the curious nature of the resource would spread a little paranoia amongst the rest of the room. And lastly, Miskatonic University is made up of the head of science and a researcher, our tech team, encouraged to come up with new technology for the other teams to use, and capable of gathering a resource called Eldritch Knowledge from the start of the game. The smallest team, but with perhaps more of a focus than the others. The intent was similar to City Hall's ability to create laws that added rules to the game. Miskatonic could create tech that would add rules to the game. So I feel like I've mentioned this too many times already, but a big part of my design was ensuring asymmetry, that each team felt completely different from the offset. Now, obviously this comes within a limited framework, particularly since with a Megagame there is no winner as such, but my understanding was that whilst most Megagames had a few variable roles within the context of their world, they relied more on the players to create that feeling, whilst teams' capabilities tended to lack individuality. The mechanics are not that varied, it's the team's objective that create who they are. My philosophy was more about tailoring each team's mechanics in a way that informed their objectives without telling them what to do. For example, most teams were capable of some kind of action that produced resources. City Halls was flavoured as a goods that they could be commissioned from the city's manufacturing plants, but the more panicked the city was, the less they could get, so they were mechanically incentivised to keep the city population calm without us having to outright tell them that they had to. I felt I needed to do everything I could to guide the players in what would hopefully prove an exciting direction. Again, not claiming I completely aced that goal or that I cracked the secret to running a Megagame, just that that was and will continue to be my intention. So, rather than give each team a little bit of something that made them special and hoping it sparked conversation, cooperation or conflict, I gave each team a completely unique set of actions that only they could do. The university could develop tech, the police and hospital were attempting to quell their respective disasters, Independence Square could gather militia, the station was spreading rumours, and so forth. I also gave each team a brief that outlined their place in the city, their opinions of some of the other factions, and a few goals they could pursue over the course of the game, but more on that in a moment. Each team table had these 4 items. An action sheet unique to their factions, some with more actions than others and some with charts and trackers for various game elements. A phase sheet, also unique to each faction, that gives an overview of their abilities and the steps they should follow during each phase of the game. A miniature version of the city map, so they had a quick reference for the main city map that made up the universal game board. This also included a quick reference and had all the teams colour coordinated in accordance to their position in the city, so players could easily recognise other teams' pieces. And a storage sheet to help organise supplies and units they had in play. The last 2 were universally the same and in retrospect were a bit weak. Also in the room, and concerning everyone, was firstly the main supply, a table where players managed their incoming and outgoing resources, food, medicine, weapons, fuel and materials. We also had valuables, that was the generic game's money, but these didn't really come into play, and honestly it was me overthinking how hard it would be to balance the economy if we literally included money as a resource. We also had a couple of universally available dice known as Clues and Eldritch Knowledge. Most teams didn't have context for these 2 sets of dice at the beginning of the game. The exception there was that the police could collect clues and the university could collect Eldritch Knowledge, which was a last minute addition that I think turned out to be key to the game's progression. However, these resources were not infinite, and when the players spent them, instead of going back into their respective supplies, they went into a collective bin represented by this chest. Each round we would reseed the supplies, but they would frequently run out, and that was by design. We wanted the economy to be choked. The city was isolated and production was limited, even for teams that directly created resources. After all, something can't be made out of nothing, and the raw materials required to make food, for example, could still run out. I didn't want the players to be able to create an infinite loop of income. I wanted to force cooperation, trade and compromise, and I think we mostly succeeded on that front, though there's some tweaks I would make for the next run. Secondly, we come to the city map. Most teams had at least one player who could approach the city map, a universally controlled area that showed the layout of the city in more detail, as well as the placement of disaster effects such as disease and crime. Some players could place actions here, and those with deployable abilities could place units to represent their activity about the city. But it also contained the previously mentioned investigation cards, the driving force for the story of our game. Investigations were a unique action that players capable of acting at the city map could take. Cards were scattered about the city, some placed with purpose, but mostly they were randomised. Upon investigating a region with an investigation card, players drew the card and enacted the effects upon it. Sometimes it would be the discovery of resources or other game elements, or a simple flavour text scenario that helped to flesh out the story of the city, but sometimes these cards referred to the numbers deck at the side of the board. Players might be given a choice or told to roll their dice, and depending on the outcome draw a specific number card from the deck to learn the consequences. This allowed us to build the mystery of the game, as some were never drawn simply because the players didn't get to them, or making a choice of multiple cards to draw meant the other options could now never be drawn. I realised this meant I was literally writing content for the game that I knew would never be seen, but never mind, maybe it'll come up next time. The city map also contained shops where resources could be purchased or looted, and players could scavenge the city for random supplies from the bag, as well as being able to freely gather materials. And by default, the city map acted as the focal point for any big events that were happening, such as when the police attempted a coup at City Hall, and Independence Square popped up to defend democracy, whilst also wanting the mayor to step down and hand power over to them, leading to a tense standoff that narrowly avoided bloodshed. This set the precedent that allowed the game's finale, a battle between the people and extra-dimensional forces, to be played out there. But it's important to note that I didn't know that was going to be the finale when the game began.
The man Batmobile is on what side?
We are trying to stop the music.
Sure. And so that's fair. Two police actions also trying to stop the music.
Yep.
Yep. And 4 squad cars, the Batmobile. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 police units. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 11 militia, 2 tanks. Okay, the news tank, I'm guessing. Is
Yes,
the news tank?
yeah, we want the news.
2 tanks.
News tank.
The news.
the only ones trying to stop
And we want to use
Yes.
the psychic radio from the Union Station.
Alright, so
If you've watched anything else on my channel, you'll likely have seen that I approach running role-playing games very loosely. I want to see what interests the players and build a story around that, and from my understanding that fits a Megagame quite well, though again, I've still never played one so I'm largely guessing. but the intention seems to be for the story to be a loose framework for the players to engage with at their leisure, and conflict between them driving the narrative, artificial though it often is. However, it was the contrived nature of that I was wary of. You can try to rely on the players to cause their own problems, and players often will, but it's better to massage them in one direction or the other and then leave them with the choice of how to pursue those avenues. This is where the briefs came in. As I said before, each team had a brief that detailed their place in the city, their opinion of a few other factions, some information on the city, and some goals they could pursue through the course of the game. But these were written with a heavy bias. Rather than writing each brief as an information leaflet, I wrote them from the perspective of the team itself, meaning they were often inaccurate depictions of the city, with contradictory information scattered throughout, mixed with vague, unrealistic goals and straight-up lies about the other teams. This was step one in manipulating the players to move the game in a direction that they could spark conflict and promote individuality, and it had an unexpected side effect. Whether this was simply an inevitable element of a megagame, again, I cannot say for sure, but the players were clearly aware that each team was receiving unique information from Control, and thus assumed that everybody else had a secret they didn't know. This was sometimes true, we were often seeding information very selectively, but the side effect was how many lies and conspiracies the players invented on their own. For example, very early in the game, a conspiracy grew around the number of sick and injured who had congregated around the church and graveyard. The hospital dealt with it quickly, but several teams assumed the hospital was hiding something when they refused to elaborate on what they had discovered in these locations, like they were trying to keep some sort of outbreak under wraps, or perhaps a more sinister supernatural problem. Truth was, the hospital had discovered nothing. They had worked the mechanics of the game well, and successfully dealt with the disasters on the city map very efficiently. But this thread of a mysterious disease ran throughout most of the game, and we in Control didn't learn about it until quite late, and we had no idea what it was about. We came together at some point in the second half of the game to discuss which of us had started the rumour about the disease outbreak, and it turned out none of us had. We had placed a random amount of disasters about the city map during setup, and Gavin suggested that the church and subsequently the graveyard could act as a little bit of hospital overflow for people seeking comfort and shelter. Apparently, the players had seen that, someone suggested it was suspicious, and the players ran with it on their own. We did basically nothing to encourage it. This paranoia escalated somehow to when the university invented interdimensional travel. People came back from the other dimension with the glowing eye disease. Again, something Control had not intended. Other than an off-the-cuff remark Ed thinks he made about someone glowing with excitement and wonder at what they had seen in the other world. This escalated to players believing they had the disease and were under its effects, which didn't exist because they had made it up. We did catch this one in time to manipulate it a little, but really we contributed very little to either of these threads. Basically, very early on, the players correctly assumed that Control were manipulating them, but their imaginations ran wild with how far that conspiracy really went. Truthfully, we did very little to move the teams against each other, and from the offset I was fully prepared to escalate the supernatural threat if the game needed a common enemy to keep it exciting, which eventually did happen, but it turned out the vague threat was enough to sustain most of the gameplay. That being said, the goals we gave the teams didn't exactly encourage togetherness. That was the second layer of manipulation, and arguably the more blatant one. But again, the teams were under no obligation to follow these goals, and indeed, not all of them were completed, and strictly speaking, there was no reward for doing any of them. A lot of the time they were more like role-playing prompts. The hospital were told to develop laboratories, the church to get a member of each team to attend a sermon, and so forth. Abstracted ideas often with no direct mechanical usage to try and encourage the players to think outside the box. Primarily, I was hoping to be able to treat this as a role-playing game, the players coming up with their own goals and creative uses for the rules to fulfill them. The robust and varied rule set was there to fall back on, but I was mainly focused around manipulating resources and the state of the city map. They were about keeping the teams afloat and dealing with present dangers. They didn't address the larger problems of the growing supernatural threat and societal collapse. That was on the players to figure out. So we were still relying a lot on the players creating their own threads to follow, which they did with very little prompting, but I had a backup plan. In the background of the game, the larger Lovecraftian-inspired story was unfolding, one that was indifferent to the players. It did not require their input and it was not interested in their position. It was going to happen with or without them. We could increase or decrease its activity based on how necessary it was for Control to drive the story forward. Ideally, we would have to do this very little, and thankfully, that's how we ended up. But it was there if we needed it. I won't spoil the specifics because we might use it again, but I had seeded a number of clues throughout the investigation cards. As mentioned, these plays out like a choose-your-own-adventure inspired by games like Time Stories and This War of Mine. Players might spot what looks like a cult gathering and be offered the choice to try and infiltrate it or to simply observe who comes and goes from a safe distance. Both options have their advantages, but choosing one causes the card to be discarded, meaning the other option is now gone. Scattered throughout these cards was the larger story, but we didn't know if this would spark the players into action or simply be a cool Easter egg for the end of the game when all was revealed. And a lot of these elements relied on multiple sources of information being brought together. No one player could uncover the whole story, or at least it was very unlikely. Again, this forced cooperation meant we couldn't know how much of the story would actually come out. As it happened, we actually overestimated the importance players would put on investigating. Possibly the action economy simply limited their ability to do it, so whilst the deck was stacked for more supernatural occurrences to come out later, I think the mundane nature of the early investigations meant players started to ignore the mechanic in favour of working to maintain and build their team's abilities. As a result, we began discarding investigations more regularly and actually removed about half the deck in order to get to the more interesting cards quickly. Once the weirder cards started coming out, the players who found them became obsessed, and investigations began to ramp up, meaning that almost all of the plot threads were uncovered, albeit a bit scattershot. This would have allowed us to pit the otherworldly threat against the city for the finale. However, for a variety of reasons, the city ended up split on which side of the conflict they wanted to be on. So we actually ended up with a player versus player showdown, some attempting to exacerbate the situation whilst others hoped to slow it. The Lovecraftian threat, whilst prominent and exposed, still ended up being background noise to the larger player conflict taking place, which by pure chance ended up being the best combination of events that I don't think we could have manufactured if we had tried. Some teams set up defences, some came to tear them down, and others attempted to join forces with the otherworldly attackers in their onslaught, all of it covered in just enough chaos for no one to be quite sure if what they were doing was for the best. In the end, the defenders won, and the gateway to the otherworld was closed, but it was close. I wasn't present for all of it, so I'm actually piecing some of this together from the footage you have been seeing spliced into this video.
That's the game.
That's the conclusion of the game.
I was really worried we're Team Evil.
We got loads of positive feedback from the game. It was our first attempt, so there were some loose ends and iffy rules we were rightfully called out on, but on the whole, the game went great. Better than I could have hoped for, and I left on a high that I don't think I've quite come down from. I say that a lot of the outcome was pure chance, but modesty aside, it was more or less exactly as I had hoped the design would play out. I had put fail-safes and prompts to lead the players to what I hoped would be a dramatic conclusion, driven by internal conflict, and that's exactly what I got, so I can't pretend I shouldn't get some credit for that. I didn't know if it was going to work, of course, and some of it didn't, but I'm confident that I could run the game again and even work on other designs. I think that my thinking before the game started was that either the players would reach a state of conflict that we could build on in the finale, or we would have to ramp up the threat and offer each team the choice of where they wanted to stand. But it turns out the players did both those things entirely on their own, and the organic nature of how that unfolded made the game experience all the richer. There's not much I would change about how the game played out. That being said, I'm going to change a whole bunch of stuff. I mentioned that the Arkham horror angle was a late addition to the design, but now that we've found it, I think we will lean into it. It makes for a strong base for the game, and without too much alteration, you could easily swap in different story beats each time you ran the game, simply by changing the investigation decks. It would even be kind of fun to run the game with effectively no story and just let the paranoia take the players to their doom instead. Definitely working on at least 2 more runs of the game, each with a different story seed, and we'll expand the player count to a few more teams, modify what we had, some things that didn't work could be dropped, expand on things we saw the players latch onto, but honestly changing too much might defeat the point. The game played out quite differently in the brief testing that we did, and there's a lot of room for variability. For example, in this first run, City Hall pretty much collapsed immediately. They didn't want to push their power to pass laws too much, failed to get ahead of the rumours that were growing about them, and seemed to forget about the welfare of the city entirely. They were arguably the least predictable team. We also didn't anticipate that the Miskatonic University would immediately try and discover magic, or Lovecraft science that's basically magic. They went straight to the supernatural, which seems obvious now, especially as they were the only team with access to eldritch knowledge from the start of the game, but honestly, we thought it would be a slower build-up and then working on more practical inventions to ingratiate themselves with the other teams first. In the next game, they might well do that. We can't predict it. Maybe City Hall will go full authoritarian or humanitarian. Maybe the mayor won't be standing on his doorstep in a bathrobe screaming at the civil war happening outside to go away, which is what happened in our game. Point is that another group of players might behave completely differently within the same rule set, and it's hard to gather data on how the game plays if we wildly alter it. So it's not in our interest to change too much. There's some elements we need to work on, some confusing conflicts that cause too many questions, a few seemingly ineffectual mechanics that need reworking or simply scrapping, but these are fixes rather than major changes, and I personally think that's a great position to be in. So keep an eye out for more videos about the game on this channel. I'll post links below to whenever the next running is. As of recording this, the next run is on December the 3rd. I'm also probably running it in February next year, 2024. So that hopefully those will be coming up and more running again. I'm working on some other designs and other ideas. Thank you for watching. Please do like and subscribe. If you've come to this channel from this video, then please do check out my other stuff. I talk a lot about role-playing games. We run some actual play content on here, a little bit of chatting about board games and things. So it's all about gaming all the time, basically. If you want to support this channel, we do have a Ko-Fi donation page. If you can donate, we're trying to hit a target at the moment so that we can upgrade all of the equipment that we have. Again, like and subscribe. It only takes a moment. It all helps. It's all good. Drop me some thoughts below in the comments if you have any thoughts. If you were at the game and you have any thoughts that we may have missed. If you were interested in playing the game and you want to hear more about it. If you have other Megagame things that you can suggest, other channels or other videos, please do, again, drop them in the comments. Let me know some Megagame love. Definitely more Megagaming in the future, more conventions, more of everything in the future from me. So yeah, again, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. The end.